Imagine being shot, stabbed, left for dead, and somehow surviving every single time. Imagine falling 2 miles out of the sky and walking away. Imagine being mauled by a bear, abandoned by the men who were supposed to save you, and crawling 200 miles through hostile wilderness with a broken leg and an infected wound eating into your own back. History has produced people so unbelievably resilient that even their enemies, their doctors, and sometimes their own families couldn't believe they were still alive. Today, you're going to meet the toughest people history has ever produced. 6 stories, 6 impossible situations, and by the end, one man whose survival is so absurd that historians still can't quite explain how he lived through it. Let's start with a fall that should have killed her before she even hit the ground. Story 1. The girl who fell from the sky. On Christmas Eve, 1971, 17-year-old Julianne Coep boards a flight over the Peruvian rainforest with her mother, heading home after a school graduation ceremony. The plane climbs into a storm. Lightning strikes one of the wings. The aircraft breaks apart in midair, 10,000 meters above the jungle canopy. Julianne doesn't remember the fall. She remembers being strapped into her seat, spinning through the clouds. Then nothing. Then waking up, alone, still buckled into 3 connected seats, lying on the jungle floor. She has a broken collarbone, a gashed arm, and one eye swollen shut. She is completely alone. No plane. No wreckage nearby. No mother. Just jungle in every direction, and the sound of her own breathing. Here's what almost nobody survives: the fall itself. Investigators later suggest the seats may have acted like a falling leaf, spinning and slowing her descent just enough to keep her alive. It shouldn't have been enough. It was. But surviving the crash was only the beginning. Julianne is now in one of the most dangerous rainforests on Earth, with no food, no map, and no way to call for help. She spends the next 10 days alone in the Amazon, wading through rivers she knows are full of piranhas and caimans, because she remembers her father, a biologist who had spent years studying the region, once telling her that rivers eventually lead to people. It's a piece of advice that, in that moment, is the only plan she has. She finds a wound on her arm infested with maggots and pours gasoline from an abandoned boat motor into it to force them out, wincing through the pain because she knows infection alone could kill her before starvation does. She has no idea, during any of it, whether her mother survived the fall too. She doesn't yet know the truth, that she is the only passenger who made it out alive. On the 10th day, exhausted and barely able to stand, she finds a logging camp. Workers find her the next morning. She survives, one of only a handful of survivors from that flight, and the only one who is found alive. If falling out of the sky and surviving sounds unbelievable, wait until you meet the man who survived being utterly and completely abandoned by the people who left him for dead. Story 2. Left to die in the Sahara. In 1994, Italian former Olympic pentathlete Mauro Prosperi is running the Marathon des Sables, widely considered one of the toughest foot races on Earth, roughly 250 kilometers across the Sahara Desert. On the 4th day, a sandstorm swallows the course entirely. Prosperi loses the trail markers. Visibility drops to almost nothing. He keeps running, hoping to find his way back, and instead runs directly into the open desert, farther and farther from any checkpoint, any water source, any hope of rescue. 4 days, search planes fly overhead. He fires flares. Nobody sees him. He is, for all practical purposes, invisible in an ocean of sand. He survives by drinking his own urine. When that isn't enough, he eats bats he catches inside an abandoned shrine, and, when even that fails to sustain him, drinks their blood. At his lowest point, believing rescue will never come, he attempts to end his life. It doesn't work. He later says his own body refused to let him die. On day 9, half-blind, having lost nearly 40 pounds, Prosperi stumbles upon a nomadic camp, nearly 200 miles off course, deep in Algeria. He had run so far from the marathon route that rescuers had almost entirely given up. He survives the Sahara. But the next man on this list survives something that should have killed him twice, once from the attack, and once from the betrayal that came after. Story 3. Mauled, abandoned, and left to crawl. In 1823, American frontiersman Hugh Glass is scouting ahead of his fur-trapping expedition in what is now South Dakota when he stumbles into a grizzly bear and her 2 cubs. The bear doesn't run. She attacks. Glass is thrown, clawed, and bitten across his back, scalp, and throat before his companions manage to kill the animal. When they reach him, he is barely breathing, his wounds so severe that his own party assumes he cannot possibly survive the night. The expedition leader orders 2 men to stay behind, bury Glass when he dies, and catch up with the group. Instead, fearing an attack from nearby Arikara warriors, the 2 men take Glass's rifle, his knife, and his supplies, and leave him alive, alone, in the wilderness. Glass wakes up, abandoned, unarmed, with a broken leg and open wounds already crawling with maggots. What happens next takes 6 weeks. Unable to walk, Glass crawls, literally drags himself across the ground, covering roughly 200 miles of hostile frontier, through territory patrolled by the same Arikara warriors his companions had feared. He survives on wild berries and a rattlesnake he manages to kill with his bare hands. At one point, unable to reach help and watching his own wounds fester, he reportedly lets maggots eat the dead tissue out of his back to prevent infection from spreading, a survival instinct that, centuries later, doctors would recognize as a legitimate, if desperate medical technique now known as maggot debridement therapy. He eventually reaches a trading post, half-starved and barely recognizable. He lives. And remarkably, when he finally catches up with the men who abandoned him, expecting to demand justice or take revenge, he chooses to let them go instead, a decision almost as hard to believe as the 6-week crawl that preceded it. If one man's willpower can carry him 200 miles with a shredded body, what happens when an entire crew's survival depends on one leader refusing to let any of them die? Story 4. Trapped in the ice at the bottom of the world. In 1915, British explorer Ernest Shackleton and his crew of 27 men set out to cross Antarctica. They never even reach the continent. Their ship, the Endurance, becomes trapped in pack ice, slowly crushed over the following months until it sinks entirely, leaving the entire crew stranded on drifting sea ice, hundreds of miles from any hope of rescue. There is no radio, no way to call for help. Nobody on Earth knows where they are, and no rescue ship is coming, because no one even knows they're lost. Shackleton makes a decision that defines the entire ordeal. No man will be left behind, and no man will lose hope, even when hope seems mathematically unreasonable. For months, the crew camps directly on the drifting sea ice, watching it crack and shift beneath their tents, never certain whether the ice under them will hold through the night. When the floe finally becomes too unstable to survive on, they take to 3 small lifeboats, rowing through freezing, storm-battered seas to reach Elephant Island, a barren, uninhabited rock with no food supply and no way for any ship to know they're there. Elephant Island isn't rescue. It's just a slightly less lethal place to be stranded. So from there, Shackleton and 5 hand-picked men attempt something almost nobody believes is possible. An 800-mile open-boat voyage across what's considered the most violent stretch of ocean on the planet, navigating by sextant through hurricane-force waves in a boat barely 22 feet long, with no backup plan if they miss their target by even a few miles. They make it, barely, arriving battered and half-frozen on the wrong side of South Georgia Island. Then, with no climbing equipment and no rest, Shackleton and 2 companions cross a mountain range no one had ever crossed before, on foot, through the night, because stopping to sleep in the freezing cold could mean never waking up. Every single one of the 28 men who left on the Endurance survives. In an environment that has killed far better equipped expeditions, not one life is lost, because one man refused to accept that survival was impossible. That story is about endurance stretched across nearly 2 years. The next one is about a single afternoon that turns one man's body into a battlefield. Story 5. 37 wounds and still standing. In 1968, U.S. Army Special Forces medic Roy Benavidez is aboard a helicopter near the Cambodian border when he learns a 12-man reconnaissance team is surrounded, outnumbered, and dying on the ground below. He isn't ordered to go. He jumps out of the helicopter with nothing but a knife and a medical bag, and runs directly into enemy fire to reach them. The team he's trying to save is pinned down by an entire enemy battalion, far outnumbering the 12 men on the ground. Over the next 6 hours, Benavidez is shot in the leg, the stomach, and the face. He's clubbed with a rifle but hard enough to break bones. He's stabbed with a bayonet in close combat. At one point, an enemy soldier walks up, shoots him at close range, and leaves him for dead in the dirt. Benavidez gets back up. He organizes the wounded, calls in air support under direct fire, drags survivors to extraction, and personally kills several enemy soldiers in hand-to-hand combat, all while bleeding from wounds that would put most men into shock within minutes. By the time he's finally pulled onto a helicopter, doctors count 37 separate wounds across his body. When he arrives at the field hospital, a doctor believes he is already dead and begins preparing to zip him into a body bag. Benavidez, unable to speak through his injuries, spits at the doctor's face to signal that he is still alive. He survives. Years later, he receives the Medal of Honor for saving 8 men that day. If you think that's the limit of human survival, you haven't met the man historians sometimes call, quite simply, the unkillable soldier. Story 6. The Man Who Would Not Die. Sir Adrian Carton de Wiart fights in 3 wars across more than 4 decades, and by the time he's done, his medical record reads less like a biography and more like a list of things that should have ended a life several times over. In the Boer War, he's shot in the stomach and the groin. In the First World War, he's shot in the face, losing an eye. He's shot through the skull, through the hip, through the ankle, through the leg, and through the ear. He loses an entire hand, and when doctors are too slow to amputate what remains of his mangled fingers, he reportedly pulls them off himself. He survives all of it. He returns to combat again and again, seemingly unbothered by wounds that would end most soldiers' careers permanently. Then comes the Second World War. In 1941, at nearly 60 years old, the plane he's traveling in crashes into the sea off the coast of Libya. He swims to shore and is immediately captured by Italian forces. As a prisoner of war, he attempts to escape multiple times, once tunneling out of a supposedly escape-proof camp and evading capture for days before finally being caught. He is eventually released in a prisoner exchange and lives for another 22 years after the war ends, dying peacefully at the age of 83, an ending almost comically ordinary for a man who had spent his entire life daring the world to kill him and losing every time. When his own memoir was published, he reportedly described the years of war not with regret, but as some of the most exhilarating of his life. It's the kind of detail that sounds invented. It isn't. 6 people. 6 impossible situations. A teenage girl who fell out of the sky and walked out of the jungle alone. A runner who drank his own blood to survive the Sahara. A man who crawled 200 miles after being left for dead. A crew that beat the Antarctic without losing a single life. A medic who kept fighting with 37 wounds in his body. And a soldier who seemed to treat bullets as a minor inconvenience across 3 wars. What connects all of them isn't luck, though luck plays its part in every one of these stories. It's something harder to explain. A refusal, at the exact moment when giving up would be the reasonable choice, to actually do it. Historians can document the wounds, the timelines, the medical records. What none of them can fully explain is the will that kept these people moving, crawling, swimming, and fighting long after their bodies had every reason to stop. That might be the real lesson here. The limits of human endurance aren't where we think they are. They're further out, much further, than almost anyone ever gets the chance or the misfortune to find out. If you enjoy true stories from history that seem impossible to believe, subscribe for more documentaries.